Tell me about, you know, Bitcoin. My good friend Max Kaiser is, his name is Max, and he is a maximalist. For him, it is Bitcoin or nothing. And, I respect Max. And I had Michael Saylor on the show. And, of course, Michael Saylor is choosing to own Bitcoin for his public company balance sheet. And I think that's a really smart move. He said, Brian, I like Bitcoin because it has low aspirations. It's not trying to be something else. It's also massively decentralized. And Jeff Booth has a lot of good things to say about it. How do you feel about other cryptocurrencies? And how do you feel about the Ethereum and the other ecosystems? Obviously, everything is growing super fast. What is it, 2.85 trillion market cap now across all the coins. There's what, 12, 14,000 protocols now, and there's obviously some coming at a very shocking rate with very little information. But how do you look at that from an investor analysis?
So a couple ways. One is that I separate Bitcoin from the others in the sense that Bitcoin is the one that I think is decentralized enough to call sound money, in the sense that there's no one who can change the monetary policy of it. It's kind of designed in such a way. If we go back for a second for trade-offs, right? So when you build a blockchain, what essentially you're doing is you're making an inefficient database. And it's a database that has the unique capability that it can be stored in anyone's personal device around the world. And that comes with advantages, mainly decentralization. But it also comes with tons of trade-offs, because if you're going to have thousands or millions of people store your database, it has to be tiny, it has to be low bandwidth. And so it has to be this really small and tight database. And the more you try to add features to that or add throughput to that, you're sacrificing some degree of decentralization. And so there's that trade-off there. So Bitcoin is built like a cockroach in that space. It's basically fully optimized for as much decentralization as possible, and is willing to sacrifice other variables. And that's what gives it that sound money quality. Back in 2017, in the block size war, 80% of the hash rate, the largest maker of Bitcoin miners, which was almost a monopoly, the largest exchanges and custodians, and some of the earlier developers all teamed up, and they wanted to change Bitcoin's block size, and they couldn't do it. And so it was basically because of that distributed node network, because of that decentralization, it's almost impossible to change without utterly massive consensus to change something. And even then, when it changes, with for example, this upcoming Taproot soft fork, it changes through soft forks, rather than hard forks. And so Bitcoin, in that sense, is something that I consider to be sound money at this point. Whereas when you go into other cryptos, I think it's on one hand, if they're fully transparent with what they're doing, and they're basically acknowledging the trade-offs that they're making, there's certainly experimentation to be had here. And even, for example, some of the things started on Ethereum end up going onto Bitcoin DeFi as well. So there's innovation in the space. The challenge that we run into in those other projects is that by expanding complexity on the base layer, they sacrifice some degree of decentralization. And there's a spectrum there. And so with, say, Ethereum, obviously you put smart contracts into the base layer. So one issue is, so you have a lot more features. You can do a lot more with it. You can do DeFi, you can do stable coins, you can do NFTs, whereas Bitcoin can only do that with additional layers put on top of it. So that's a whole different design philosophy. Whereas with Ethereum, you can do all in the base layer. The downside is, so in order to do all these changes, and they kind of, their culture is based around changes and iteration and improvement, they put, for example, difficulty bombs in the code. And so they change through hard forks rather than soft forks. So it kind of takes away a lot of the power of the nodes. And in addition, the block size grows so much faster than Bitcoin's does, where in a few years, you're going to need multiple terabytes of data if you want to be able to validate the entire blockchain. And it's harder to sync it, and then they're going to go to proof of stake and just change that system. And so there's more centralization risk there. And then we get into another project. If you see the Bitcoins and the Ethereums arguing with each other, it's often about decentralization and risk and things like that. Then if you get into something like Solana, where you have a proof of stake smart contract chain, it has a lot more throughput than Ethereum, so a lot cheaper fees, but it comes with even more centralization. So you often see the Ethereans criticize Solana for being too centralized. And they, as an example of how centralized Solana is, they still do manual slashing. So proof of stake works on slashing, meaning that, if a proof of work miner verifies the wrong blockchain, their punishment is simply that they mine blocks that don't make it into the main chain. Therefore, they wasted real world resources. And that's their own punishment. Whereas in a proof of stake, because you're not using real resources to validate, you're using your tokens, you have to get some of your tokens taken away if you vote for the wrong chain. And Solana still has manual slashing. So it's not even a fully automated blockchain. The developers still essentially have complete control over it at the end of the day. And we saw, a couple months ago, it went down for 17 hours, the entire blockchain, and had to be like manually, they had to like talk and manually restart it at the validators. And so there's a spectrum of decentralization there. And so I put Bitcoin in one bucket, and all the others are kind of these experimental tech equities. And so it's two very different types of investments. It's kind of like comparing, like a startup company with no profit yet that's kind of getting an idea off the ground versus an established business, right? So it's two very different ways of looking at it. But then another thing I do is that I separate price action from fundamentals. So for example, in my research service, I would talk about these issues with Ethereum, but then say, I think for the next year it's going a lot higher, right? So, and I would talk about some of the supply squeezes that are happening with it. I basically, once it broke over 1400 back in like January or February, that's when I became quite bullish on Ethereum along with Bitcoin in my service and in terms of price, and said, unlike Bitcoin, I don't have a long-term view on this necessarily. I don't know if this is going to be the winner of the smart contract chains. Here's all the centralization risks, but all else being equal, there's a really attractive supply squeeze here. It's probably going higher. And I did the same thing for Solana. So for example, 2.5 months ago, I said Solana has a good probability of flipping Cardano. And back then, Cardano was 90 billion market cap, and Solana was 40 billion. And a couple, less than a week ago, they did flip. At least for the moment. And so I separate price action from those fundamentals to some degree, for at least for the coins that I cover, which is generally only say the top 10 coins.